The gavel struck the wooden bench with a sound that seemed to echo through every corner of the packed courtroom. But what happened next would leave everyone speechless and change how justice works forever. Judge Harrison looked down from his elevated bench with the kind of cold stare that had intimidated lawyers for over 2 decades. His gray hair perfectly combed and his black robe draped like armor around his imposing frame. But today, he was about to meet someone who wouldn't be intimidated. Welcome to Voice of the Black, where we amplify the stories that matter and celebrate the strength that refuses to be silenced. Before we dive into this incredible courtroom showdown that will leave you on the edge of your seat, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that talent and preparation can overcome any prejudice, hit that subscribe button and join our community of voices that refuse to be ignored. Kira Davis adjusted the collar of her navy blue blazer as she stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse. At 28 years old, she stood exactly 5 feet 6 inches with her natural black hair styled in a sleek low bun that framed her face perfectly. Her dark brown eyes held a mixture of determination and quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of preparation and an unshakable belief in justice. She wore a crisp white blouse beneath her blazer, her appearance professional and polished, but what truly set her apart was the way she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who belonged exactly where she was. This wasn't just another case for Kira. This was the Marcus Thompson case, a 19-year-old college student who had been wrongfully arrested and charged with armed robbery based on nothing more than a vague description and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. For 6 months, Kira had worked tirelessly on this case, spending countless hours reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building what she knew was an airtight defense. She had graduated summa cum laude from Howard University Law School, passed the bar on her first try, and had already won several high-profile cases in her young career. But today felt different. As she walked down the marble corridor, her heels clicking against the polished floor, Kira noticed the way some people looked at her. There were whispers, sideways glances, and that familiar feeling of being sized up and found wanted before she even opened her mouth. She was used to it by now, but it never stopped stinging. In a profession still dominated by older white men, she had learned to let her work speak for itself, but she also knew that sometimes that was enough. The courtroom was already filling up when she arrived. Marcus Thompson sat at the defendant's table, his young face etched with worry and exhaustion. His mother sat in the front row of the gallery, clutching a tissue and trying to hold herself together. Kira placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder as she sat down beside him, opening her briefcase and spreading out her meticulously organized files. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly, her voice warm but professional. Marcus looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. "Scared," he admitted. "My mom keeps saying the best, but what if it's not enough?" Kira met his eyes directly. "I've been preparing for this moment for 6 months, Marcus. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every legal precedent. Trust me when I say we're ready." As the morning progressed, the courtroom continued to fill. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Robert Kane, took their seats at the opposite table. Kane was a veteran prosecutor with a reputation for being tough and uncompromising, but also fair. He nodded politely at Kira when their eyes met, a gesture of professional respect that she appreciated. Then, at exactly 9:30 a.m., the bailiff called the courtroom to order. "All rise." The Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding. The room fell silent as Judge Harrison entered from his chambers. He was a tall, imposing man in his early 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He had been on the bench for over 20 years and had a reputation for running a strict courtroom. But as his gaze swept across the room and landed on Kira, something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Kira caught it. A slight narrowing of his eyes, a barely perceptible tightening around his mouth. "Please be seated," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying easily throughout the courtroom. "We are here today for the case of the state versus Marcus Thompson. Will counsel please state their appearances for the record?" District Attorney Kane stood first. "Robert Kane for the prosecution, Your Honor." Then it was Kira's turn. She rose smoothly from her chair, her posture straight and confident. "Kira Davis of the defense, Your Honor." Judge Harrison looked at her for a long moment, longer than necessary, and Kira felt that familiar tension in the air. "Ms. Davis," he said finally, his tone neutral but somehow carrying an undertone she didn't like. "I trust you're prepared for today's proceedings?" It was an odd question. Prosecutors and defense attorneys weren't typically asked about their level of preparation during opening statements. Kira kept her expression steady. "Yes, Your Honor. Fully prepared." "Good," the judge replied, but something in his tone suggested he doubted her words. "Let's proceed with opening statements. Mr. Kane, you may begin." Kane stood and delivered a competent opening statement, outlining the prosecution's case against Marcus Thompson. He spoke about the armed robbery that had taken place at a convenience store, the witness identification, and the evidence they claimed linked Marcus to crime. It was a standard prosecution opening, methodical and straightforward. When Kane finished, Judge Harrison turned to Kira. "Ms. Davis, your opening statement." Kira stood and walked to the center of the courtroom, positioning herself where the jury could see her clearly. She had practiced this opening dozens of times, and she knew every word by heart. But as she began to speak, something unexpected happened. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and confident. 6 months ago, Marcus Thompson was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But being in the wrong place at the wrong time is not a crime. "Ms. Davis," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp, "please approach the bench." Kira paused, surprised by the interruption. She was barely 30 seconds into her opening statement. She walked to the bench, followed by Kane, and they spoke in hushed tones so the jury couldn't hear. "Your Honor," Kira said quietly. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Davis, I want to make sure you understand the gravity of these proceedings. This is a serious criminal case, not a mock trial." Kira felt her jaw tighten slightly, but she kept her voice level. "I understand that completely, Your Honor. I was simply beginning my opening statement. See that you conduct yourself accordingly," the judge said dismissively. "Return to your opening." Kira walked back to the center of the courtroom, her mind racing. She had been practicing law for 3 years and had never been interrupted during an opening statement for something so minor. She glanced at the jury and saw confusion on several faces. They were wondering the same thing she was. What was that about? She resumed her opening statement, but had barely spoken for another minute when Judge Harrison interrupted again. "Ms. Davis, please speak up. I'm having trouble hearing you." This time, Kira's frustration was harder to hide. Her voice had been perfectly audible, and she knew it. She had been trained to project her voice in courtrooms, and she had never had this problem before. "Of course, Your Honor," she said, raising her voice slightly. The interruptions continued throughout her opening. Judge Harrison questioned her word choice, asked her to repeat statements that had been perfectly clear, and generally treated her as if she were a first-year law student rather than a qualified attorney. By the time she finished her opening statement, Kira was seething internally, but she maintained her professional composure. During the lunch recess, Marcus's mother approached Kira in the hallway outside the courtroom. "Ms. Davis," she said, her voice worried. "What's happening in there? Why is the judge treating you like that?" Kira chose her words carefully. "Sometimes judges have different styles, Mrs. Thompson. What matters is that we're prepared, and we are." But privately, Kira knew exactly what was happening. She had encountered judges like Harrison before, though never quite so blatantly. He had looked at her and seen a young black woman, and he had made assumptions about her competence based on that observation alone. The interruptions, the condescending tone, the unnecessary questions about her preparation, it was all designed to undermine her credibility in front of the jury. The afternoon session began with the prosecution presenting their case. Kane called several witnesses, including the convenience store clerk who had been robbed and a police officer who had responded to the scene. Their testimony was routine, and Judge Harrison allowed them to speak without interruption, occasionally nodding encouragingly. Then it was time for Kira to cross-examine the witnesses. She approached the convenience store clerk, a middle-aged man named Frank Rodriguez, with a friendly but professional demeanor. "Mr. Rodriguez," she began, "you testified that the robbery took place at approximately 9:45 p.m. on the night of March 15th. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's right." "And you said the lighting in your store was adequate to see the perpetrator clearly?" "Objection," Kane called out, leading the witness. Judge Harrison nodded immediately. Sustained. Ms. Davis, please rephrase your question. Kira paused. The question hadn't been leading at all. She had simply asked a witness to confirm testimony he had already given, but she rephrased anyway. Mr. Rodriguez, can you describe the lighting conditions in your store on the night of the robbery? It was normal lighting. We have fluorescent lights overhead. And would you say this lighting was sufficient for you to clearly see someone's face? Objection, Kane said again. Calls for speculation. This time, Kira spoke up before the judge could rule. Your Honor, I'm asking about the witness's personal observation of the lighting conditions in his own store. Judge Harrison looked at her with obvious annoyance. Ms. Davis, I don't need you to explain basic courtroom procedure to me. Objection sustained. Kira felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she pressed on. Every question she asked was met with objections from Kane, and Judge Harrison sustained nearly every one, even when they were clearly improper objections. Meanwhile, during Kane's direct examination, similar questions had been allowed without any objections at all. The pattern became so obvious that members of the jury began exchanging glances. Even Kane started to look uncomfortable with how one-sided the judge's rulings were becoming. During her cross-examination of the police officer, Detective James Murphy, Kira asked about the identification procedure that had led to Marcus being arrested. Detective Murphy, you testified that Mr. Thompson was identified through a photographic lineup. Is that correct? Yes. How many photographs were shown to the witness? 6 photographs. And were all 6 photographs of black men? Objection. Kane called out, though his voice lacked conviction. On what grounds? Kira asked, turning to look at Kane. Kane hesitated. Relevance. Judge Harrison didn't hesitate. Sustained. This time, several jury members looked openly puzzled. The racial composition of a photo lineup was clearly relevant to its fairness and reliability. Kira knew she was being railroaded, but she also knew she had to be careful about how she responded. Your Honor, she said calmly, the Supreme Court has held that the composition of photographic lineups is directly relevant to their reliability and admissibility. This is established precedent. Judge Harrison's face darkened. Ms. Davis, are you attempting to lecture me on the law? No, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to understand a basis for sustaining an objection to a clearly relevant question. Approach the bench, Judge Harrison ordered, his voice icy. Kira and Kane walked to the bench again, but this time the judge's demeanor was openly hostile. Ms. Davis, he said in a harsh whisper, I'm warning you. If you continue to question my rulings in front of the jury, I will hold you in contempt of court. Kira felt her heart racing, but she kept her voice steady. Your Honor, I'm simply trying to provide an adequate defense for my client. The questions I'm asking are well within the bounds of established law. I'll determine what's within the bounds of law in my courtroom. Judge Harrison snapped. Do I make myself clear? Kira looked at him for a long moment, seeing the barely concealed hostility in his eyes. She was at a crossroads. She could back down, apologize, and try to get through the rest of the trial with minimal confrontation. Or she could stand her ground and fight for her client's right to a fair trial. She thought about Marcus Thompson, sitting at the defendant's table, trusting her to fight for his freedom. She thought about his mother, who had worked double shifts to pay for his defense. She thought about every black defendant who had been railroaded by biased judges and inadequate representation. Crystal clear, Your Honor, she said quietly. But as she walked back to her position, Kira was already formulating a new strategy. If Judge Harrison wanted to play games, she would show him what happened when he played games with someone who had spent her entire career preparing for moments exactly like this one. The rest of the afternoon continued in the same pattern. Judge Harrison sustained objection after objection, many of them clearly improper. He interrupted Kira multiple times to clarify points that needed no clarification. He even went so far as to explain basic legal concepts to her in front of the jury, treating her like a student rather than a qualified attorney. But Kira noticed something else happening. The jury was getting angry, not at her, but at the obvious unfairness they were witnessing. Several jurors were taking notes, not just about the testimony, but about the judge's behavior. One older woman in the front row shook her head visibly when Judge Harrison sustained a particularly egregious objection. When court recessed for the day, Kira gathered her files and walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. In the hallway, she was approached by an older black man who had been sitting in the gallery. "Young lady," he said quietly, "I've been practicing law for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened in there today." Kira nodded. "I appreciate that, sir. What do you even do about it?" Kira looked back at the closed courtroom doors. "I'm going to win this case." That night, Kira worked until nearly 3 a.m., preparing for the next day. But she wasn't just preparing her examination of witnesses or her legal arguments. She was preparing for war. The next morning, Kira arrived at court early. She had spent the night not just reviewing her case files, but researching Judge Harrison himself. What she found was enlightening and disturbing. Harrison had been overturned on appeal more frequently than any other judge in the county, and nearly every reversal involved cases with black defendants. There had been multiple complaints filed against him with the State Judicial Conduct Board, though none had resulted in any meaningful sanctions. More importantly, Kira had researched the specific legal standards for judicial bias and misconduct. She knew exactly what she needed to establish if she was going to challenge Harrison's behavior directly. When court reconvened, Kira was ready to present her defense. Her first witness was Dr. Emily Chun, a forensic psychologist who specialized in eyewitness identification. "Dr. Chun," Kira began, "you reviewed the identification procedures used in this case. Is that correct?" "Yes, I have." "In your expert opinion, were these procedures conducted in accordance with best practices for reliable identification?" Kane stood to object, but before he could speak, Judge Harrison interrupted. "Ms. Davis, I'm going to stop you right there. This court doesn't need to hear from some expert about what constitutes proper police procedure." Kira felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time she was ready for it. "Your Honor, expert testimony on eyewitness identification is routinely admitted in criminal cases. The reliability of identification testimony is directly relevant to my client's guilt or innocence. I've made my ruling, Ms. Davis." "Your Honor, I respectfully request that you state the legal basis for excluding this testimony." Judge Harrison's face flushed red. "Ms. Davis, you are dangerously close to contempt." This time, Kira didn't back down. "Your Honor, I have a constitutional obligation to provide zealous representation for my client. That includes the right to present relevant expert testimony. I'm asking for the legal basis for your ruling, so that I can preserve this issue for appeal if necessary." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Kane looked surprised by Kira's direct challenge to the judge's authority. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "Are you telling me how to run my courtroom, Ms. Davis?" Kira stood perfectly still, her voice calm and clear. "No, Your Honor. I'm asking you to run your courtroom in accordance with the law." The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes. Kira could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She had just crossed a line that few attorneys ever dare to cross, directly challenging a judge's legal knowledge in open court. Finally, Judge Harrison spoke. "I'll allow the witness to testify, but keep it brief." It was a small victory, but Kira knew it was significant. She had forced Harrison to back down in front of the jury, and everyone in the courtroom had seen it happen. Dr. Chen's testimony was devastating to prosecution's case. She explained how the identification procedures used were textbook examples of how not to conduct a lineup. All 6 photographs showed black men with similar features. The lighting conditions in the store had been poor, and the witness had been shown Marcus's photo multiple times before finally identifying him. Kane's cross-examination was weak, and Judge Harrison's attempts to limit Dr. Chen's testimony only made her points more emphatic. Kira's next witness was Marcus Thompson himself. Marcus took the stand and told his story simply and honestly. On the night of the robbery, he had been at the library studying for midterm exams until it closed at 9 p.m. He had then walked to a nearby coffee shop to continue studying, passing by the convenience store around 9:30 p.m. The robbery had occurred 15 minutes later, by which time Marcus was already at the coffee shop, surrounded by witnesses. "Marcus," Kira said gently, "did you rob Rodriguez's convenience store on the night of March 15th? No, ma'am. I absolutely did not. During Kane's cross-examination, he tried to poke holes in Marcus's timeline, but the young man's story remained consistent and believable. Then Judge Harrison took over the questioning himself, which was highly unusual. Mr. Thompson, the judge said, his tone skeptical, "You're asking this jury to believe that it's just a coincidence that you happened to walk past the same store that was robbed minutes later?" Marcus looked confused by the question. "Your Honor, I walk past that store every day on my way to the coffee shop. It's on my regular route." "How convenient," Judge Harrison said sarcastically. Kira stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The court is offering commentary rather than asking questions." Judge Harrison glared at her. "Overruled. The witness will answer." "Your Honor." There was no question pending. "Ms. Davis, sit down." Kira remained standing. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that the court's comment be stricken from the record as inappropriate judicial commentary." The tension in the courtroom was electric. Judge Harrison was visibly furious, but he was also trapped. Kira was right, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. "The court's comments will stand," he said finally. "Then I respectfully request a mistrial based on judicial bias and misconduct." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped. Requesting a mistrial based on judicial misconduct was the nuclear option in criminal defense, and it was rarely successful. But Kira had been building toward this moment since the trial began. Judge Harrison's face went white, then red, then white again. "Approach the bench immediately." Kira and Kane walked the bench, but this time the atmosphere was different. Kane looked genuinely concerned, and Judge Harrison looked like a man who suddenly realized he had gone too far. "Ms. Davis," Judge Harrison said in a harsh whisper, "you are making a very serious accusation." "Yes, Your Honor, I am, and I'm prepared to back it up with specific examples of bias and misconduct that have occurred over the past 2 days. Judge Harrison stared at her for a long moment. "You're making a mistake, young lady. The only mistake will be failing to protect my client's constitutional rights." Kane cleared his throat. "Your Honor, perhaps we should take a brief recess to address these concerns." Judge Harrison looked from Kane to Kira and back again. He was clearly calculating his options, and none of them were good. If he denied the mistrial motion, Kira would almost certainly appeal any conviction, and the appellate court would review his conduct throughout the trial. If he granted the mistrial, it would be an admission that his behavior had been inappropriate. "Motion denied," he said finally. "Return to your seats." But as they walked back, Kira noticed something different in Judge Harrison's demeanor. The open hostility was still there, but it was tempered now by wariness. He was finally taking her seriously as an opponent. The trial continued, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Judge Harrison was still biased, but he was being more careful about how he expressed it. His objections were still one-sided, but they were legally defensible. His comments were still inappropriate, but they were more subtle. Most importantly, the jury had seen what kind of attorney Kira Davis really was. They had watched her stand up to a hostile judge, challenge improper rulings, and refuse to be intimidated. When she spoke, they listened with respect and attention. During closing arguments, Kira delivered a masterful summation that tied together all the evidence of Marcus's innocence. She spoke about reasonable doubt, about the unreliability of the identification, about the solid alibi testimony. But she also spoke about something else. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, looking each of them in the eye, "you have witnessed something over the past 3 days that goes beyond the evidence in this case. You have seen how easy it is for bias and assumption to cloud judgment. You have seen how quickly someone can be treated as guilty simply because of how they look or where they come from." Kane objected, but Judge Harrison let the statement stand. "Marcus Thompson is not guilty of this crime," Kira continued. "The evidence proves that beyond any doubt. But even if you have questions about the evidence, even if you think there might be room for doubt, remember this. In America, we don't convict people based on assumptions. We don't send young men to prison because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. We convict people based on evidence, and the evidence in this case points to one conclusion: Marcus Thompson is innocent." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison asked. The foreman, an older white man who had been taking extensive notes throughout the trial, stood up. We have, Your Honor. Please read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Thompson not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted. Marcus's mother began crying tears of relief. Marcus himself sat in stunned silence for a moment before breaking into a smile. Even some members of the gallery applauded. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. He had lost, and everyone knew it. As the courtroom cleared, several jurors approached Kira to congratulate her. The foreman pulled her aside. Ms. Davis, he said quietly, I want you to know that what you did in there took real courage. That judge was out of line from the beginning, and you never let him intimidate you. Kira thanked him, but she was already thinking about what came next. As she packed up her files, she noticed Judge Harrison watching her from the bench. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw something that she hadn't seen before: respect. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and his mother were waiting for her. Ms. Davis, Marcus said, I don't know how to thank you. Kira smiled. You don't need to thank me, Marcus. You just need to go back to school and live your life. What about that judge? Marcus's mother asked. Is he going to keep treating people like that? Kira looked back at the courthouse. That's something I'm going to look into. 2 weeks later, Kira filed a formal complaint against Judge Harrison with the State Judicial Conduct Board. Her complaint was detailed, specific, and supported by the trial transcript. 3 months after that, Judge Harrison announced his early retirement, citing health concerns. But for Kira, the real victory wasn't Harrison's retirement or even Marcus's acquittal. The real victory was a message she had sent to every prosecutor, every judge, and every defendant who might cross her path in the future. She would not be intimidated. She would not be silenced, and she would never stop fighting for justice. 6 months later, Kira received a letter from a young black law student who had been in the courtroom during Marcus's trial. Ms. Davis, the letter read, I watched you stand up to that judge, and it changed my life. I had been thinking about quitting law school because I didn't think someone like me could make it in this profession. But after seeing what you did, I realized that someone like me isn't just needed in this profession. We're essential. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like. Kira kept that letter on her desk as a reminder that the fight for justice isn't just about winning individual cases. It's about changing the system, one case at a time, one judge at a time, one young lawyer at a time. And in a profession where too many people stay silent in the face of injustice, Kira Davis had found her voice, and she was never going to lose it again.